Whenever I sit down to write one of these reviews for a HBO Game of Thrones show, I try to do it from an objective point of view and try and look at it through the lens from that hardcore book reading part of the fanbase, as well as the more casual and general audience. But I've actually found that very difficult to do with this review, with those two viewpoints fundamentally clashing. To try and view it as someone from the general audience, I would have to try and turn off that part of my brain that loves these stories as much as I do, who's read the novellas a dozen times. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms does such a good job at bringing George R. Martin's world to screen, I struggle to get into that general audience perspective. The general consensus among fans is this is the best adapted season for a Game of Thrones show since a Game of Thrones was adapted into season 1 of Game of Thrones. And from what I've seen thus far from A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, I genuinely do believe, unless it now horribly goes off the rails, that it could be as good or even better. It very much seems that showrunner Ira Parker understood the assignment, and it's not hard to understand why George R. Martin has been so publicly pleased with the outcome this time around. But, and here's the thing, and something I will get into in this review, while I think the show will be beloved by fans, I fear it won't make the same kind of impact for more casual or general audiences that Game of Thrones and to some extent House of the Dragon did, for one very simple reason: the very nature of what the tales of Sir Duncan the Tall and Egg are about. The hardest part of bringing A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms to screen was always going to be its tone. It's a much smaller, light-hearted story with a distinct sense of humour that makes it firmly stand out against the main A Song of Ice and Fire book series. From what we've seen so far from this first episode, I think it's fair to say that Ira Parker has done the job at bringing the vibe and feeling of the book to screen. The characters are endearing, and watching Dunk try and navigate this world of lords and princes is fun to watch. We as viewers very much feel Dunk's trepidation as he moves around the tourney ground, talks to the Master of Games, interacts with the other knights and lords. We very much see his imposter syndrome. When the show was first announced, I highlighted in a video the biggest issue they were going to have to deal with when writing is that Duncan is the only point of view. Thus much of the exposition is given via his internal monologue. There are of course also other events that happen off screen that we hear about via Duncan that the show will also have to find creative ways of showing, but so far it does seem like they found a way to make it work. Having Duncan talk aloud to the horses makes a lot of sense, and I think it will definitely help more casual viewers connect with him as a character, especially if my fiance's reaction to it is anything to go by. They also made use of very brief flashbacks that for the most part worked very well, and helped establish the relationship between Duncan and Sir Arlen of Pennytree, and give the viewer an idea of what Arlen was like as a character, and the kind of mentor figure he is to Sir Duncan. However, while I think this really worked well in the opening segment of the show, while Duncan was digging Arlen's grave, I think they were kind of unnecessary later on in the episode. I think there was one case in particular where it kind of took you out of the moment. But a real testament to just how well the books have transitioned from page to screen actually comes in the scene that has been added to the show. The scene in which Dunk has supper in the tent of Lionel Baratheon. During his speech, Lionel mentions how our ancestors held the first tourney on these very fields. This is some very deep cuts of lore that for me show that Ira Parker not only did his research, but understood the assignment he'd been given. Because in lore, the first ever tourney was indeed held in the Reach during the Age of Heroes. It's not a well-known or common bit of lore, and only something I actively knew about because I recently made a video about the history of tourneys in Westeros. So, the attention to detail here is to be commended, and you can tell that to include such an obscure piece of lore means the writing really has come from a place of love for the source material. The tourney in the world itself very much feels like a living and breathing thing. It feels alive, lived in and real. From the interaction we had with the innkeep, to the buzz of activity around the tourney ground, the puppeteers performing Serwyn of the Mirror Shield, and hell, even the sympathetic relationship between Dunk and the whores, as they see they have more in common than it first seems. By making the world feel alive and so real, it helps you as a viewer get lost in the story, and I hope it had the same effect with the general audience. Adaptation purists will often reject the notion that new content and scenes need to be added when bringing a story from page to screen. But the reality is there are just some things you can do on page that just do not work on TV. Especially when you're trying to adapt a story with a single point of view. There are some blanks that do need to be filled in that can be covered in a few lines in text, but in reality are whole story elements. This is something the first season of Game of Thrones did quite well, with some of the added scenes the most beloved and most memorable from that season. They worked because they matched the tone of the story being told and had a functional reason for being there. While the added scenes in Game of Thrones did not add anything story-wise, it really helped viewers connect with characters such as Robert Baratheon, Jaime Lannister, and Sir Barristan Selmy. And hell, even understand the motivations of people like Cersei Lannister. The added scene in the first episode nailed this concept. While the sequence with Lionel Baratheon's tent did very little story-wise, just functionally bridging between Duncan looking for Sir Manfred Dondarrion, it introduces us to Lionel, such an important and memorable character in the story, but also does a lot of legwork in making the tourney, again, feel real and alive. We also get a real sense of Duncan feeling out of place amongst the High Lords, yet managing still to form this friendship with a man such as Lionel Baratheon. But what makes this scene work even more is it actually makes sense. Duncan is looking for Manfred Dondarrion, who has been napping all day. House Dondarrion is sworn to House Baratheon, thus it makes sense that Duncan would then run into Manfred at the end of the night in Lionel Baratheon's tent. It ticks all the boxes when adding content into an adaptation. It enhances what's already there and is not trying to inject its own ideas, themes or concepts into the story, which is sadly the case with many adaptations, even Game of Thrones, and especially House of the Dragon, where sometimes it feels like the story is there to serve the writers, rather than the writers serving the story. The relationship between Dunk and Egg is at the very heart of the show and the book, and casting both these characters was going to make or break the show. Casting any child actor is an extremely difficult thing, and as we see from Game of Thrones and other shows like Stranger Things, where child actors are fundamentally part of the story, it can be very hit or miss. From what we've seen from Dexter Sol as Egg so far, he brings the wise beyond his years, yet insolent cheek of Egg to life very well. He has an endearing quality to him that makes it very easy for viewers to take a shine to him. In the limited screen time we've had so far of Egg, I have no doubt he will shine throughout the season, especially with some of the more complex things to come in the story. Casting Dunk was also going to be a huge challenge. Not only does he have this dry sense of humour and wit, but also is a deeply caring, complex and emotional character. He's also this huge man. It really narrows down the kind of actors you're going for. I did worry they would just cast a tallish person as Dunk, but I'm glad to see Peter Caffrey, a truly physically huge man, was cast. Not only has he shown himself to be a very good actor, but he has the physicality needed to really sell Duncan the Tall. I think it will make all the difference come the action sequences to come. With adaptations, it's also clearly obvious when an actor has read the source material and understood their character, because it translates to their performance. And this is certainly the case for Peter Caffrey with Duncan. The dynamic between Dunk and Egg, Peter and Dexter, has been spot on so far, and I cannot wait to see where it goes. When you're a fan of a book, you have your own image of the characters in your head. For me, at least, when an adaptation comes out, it is very rare that the actors in the show replace my own visions of them. The only ones who did this for Game of Thrones for me were perhaps Peter Baelish and Robert Baratheon, even though the show Robert and book Robert look very different. But Mark Addy really encompassed who Robert Baratheon was. But I do think in the future it's going to be really hard for me to pick up the novellas and not see Peter Caffrey and Dexter Sol as Dunk and Egg. I want to briefly mention Daniel Ings as Lionel Baratheon. He gave a really strong performance. But what I loved about it, and I'm not really sure how much this has to do with writing, directing or performance, but I can see shades of both Renly and Stannis Baratheon in how he's playing Lionel. And again, I really love his dynamic with Duncan, which of course will be a vital part of the story to come. If I had to level any criticisms at the show, I'm really going to have to nitpick. I was a little bit disappointed how little we saw of Daeron in the inn. However, given the context of the adaptation, it makes sense, and I'm sure we'll see plenty of him later in the story. The shitting. Well, it caught me off guard. Not sure it was entirely necessary, not too sure what it adds. Probably didn't help, I was eating at the time. it is what it is, but I worry it gave the general audience the wrong idea about what the show's about. I believe in an interview I saw with Ira Parker somewhere, it was supposed to be a Canterbury Tales reference, which Dunk and Egg and A Song of Ice and Fire is of course heavily inspired by, to some extent. But as I said, it is what it is, it's not that deep, it's just a bit odd. I know there was a lot of debate from casual fans about the run times of the episodes and the number of episodes for the season in the build-up, and I strongly defended the choice to have 6 half-hour episodes, given the size and nature of the story being told. But it's not until I actually have watched the first episode, I realised why this might be a bigger issue than fans have given it credit for. Namely, we as more hardcore fans watch the show from a point of view of knowing the story, what's going to happen and where it's going to go. Therefore, we give it a lot of leeway in terms of pacing and how fast the plot is moving. I do wonder if going into the show blind, if this slow burn pacing is going to be an issue on account of the fact you don't know what the payoff is going to be for this slow burn. My fiance was definitely left wanting to see more, but felt the story moved too slow. I don't know how much of the general audience also felt like that. The thing is, I'm not sure what the answer to that would be. I think Ira Parker has been limited to the structure of the novellas, and frankly, 6 half-hour episodes are probably the best format for it. You could do 3-hour-long episodes, but then the season's too short. You could do it as a movie, however I think that then limits the storytelling potential needed for this adaptation to work. You can't do 6-hour-long episodes or even 45-minute episodes because there's not near enough content in the books, and it will have the bloat that plagued House of the Dragon. I do wonder, however, if there was ever going to be a Game of Thrones show to drop a season to binge watch, whether A Night at the Seven Kingdoms could have been it, or maybe drop the first 2 episodes at once at least. You sell them with episode 1, get them hooked with episode 2, as the story keeps moving. Because you've got to remember, all these reviewers that have been praising the show were all given early access and watched all the episodes in one single hit. And I wonder how different the story would feel for your average person watching it week to week in comparison. And as a result, I do wonder what the general audience reaction to the show is going to be. I have no doubt it's going to be highly critically acclaimed. It will be beloved by fans of the books. But I can't help but feel the general audience isn't going to connect with it the same way they did with House of the Dragon. But who knows? We'll have to wait and see what the numbers say. It's a much smaller show with a much smaller scale with a much smaller budget. Therefore, the metrics of what success means are different than from Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. I'm going to give this first episode of A Night at the Seven Kingdoms a solid 8.5 out of 10, which, if you know this channel, is a very high score from me. I'm feeling very positive about the outlook for the next 5 episodes, and I hope it maintains this good start. Like I said, any criticism I've had thus far really have been nitpicks.